Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Have You Heard George's podcast and industry. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying Eduqas A-level media studies, as it is currently a set text on that specification. It's important to understand a little bit about the BBC in order to understand this product. The BBC is a public service broadcaster, which means that they have a remit, a particular obligation they have to fulfill, which is to inform, to educate and to entertain. And you can see this reflected within the show. There's lots of informative and educational content discussing politics, cultural affairs, issues to do with things like discrimination, racism, issues to do with things like poetry, art. So lots of informative and educational content, and also lots of entertainment, lots of discussions with celebrities, lots of guests, lots of music too. As they're a public service broadcaster, the BBC is also quite special because they are funded by a licence fee and not by advertising. That licence fee means that they don't have to appeal to a big mainstream wide audience because they're not trying to bring in huge audiences to appease advertising brands. It means they can take more risks and make more niche content. And that perhaps is why this podcast got made in the first place. It is quite a niche, risky show, being that it's aimed at a younger target audience, but also quite an educated audience who are really interested in kind of culture and politics. It's going to be quite a niche podcast. It suggests that not every company is all about profit. Part of the BBC's Royal Charter is that they have to have issues to do with diversity. They have to reflect diversity within their programming, and that is both on TV and on radio, podcasts, etc. And actually, when Ofcom did an investigation in 2017, they found that there was too little diversity at the BBC, both in terms of behind the scenes and also on screen or on radio. So in 2021, the BBC launched a diversity and inclusion programme, which meant they were actively trying to add more content that had people from ethnic minorities in production crew roles, and also people who were actually presenting content too. And perhaps this is why this programme was made when it was. The podcast is part of BBC Radio 5. Radio 5 has quite a kind of middle-aged, I would say probably 40 and over, target audience, mostly male, mostly quite wealthy, and probably mostly quite white target audience. And so perhaps bringing in this show was an attempt to try and diversify their portfolio and perhaps bring in a little bit more diversity, both in terms of age and also in terms of ethnicity, and perhaps to try and bring in more audiences to Radio 5 as a whole. Don't forget, radio stations are trying all the time to boost their listening figures, because if they don't, eventually in a few years, they won't have any listeners left, and lots of people are turning away from traditional radio now. Radio 5 is primarily talk-based, so the podcast does reflect that, being quite a talk-based show. And it's quite an unconventional structure. Although there are themes, it's a very loose theme, and it means that within each podcast there's quite a mixture of topics, and across the whole podcast it's quite a diverse mixture of topics as well. For example, the episode called Flying the Flag has narrative discussions about celebrity couples and entertainment and showbiz, and it also has discussions about the American economy. So it really goes from stuff that might be considered quite lowbrow entertainment to things that might be considered quite highbrow, cultural, informative content. George himself has total creative control over the podcast, which is quite unusual. And I guess they gave it to him and put it into his control because they trusted him. They'd seen some of his previous work, and they saw that he was good at bringing in those kind of younger, more urban audiences. The choice of George as a host would also bring in some of his pre-sold fans who might be familiar with him as a rapper, a singer, a poet, somebody who's done some presenting elsewhere. And they know that he often focuses on sort of social and political issues, and so that would bring in those audiences who really enjoy that. Ben Brick is the name of the kind of producer and the composer of some of the music and tracks within the podcast as well, and he also brings in quite a lot of pre-sold fans of his previous work. And because it's a very low budget podcast, that would have been quite appealing to the BBC as well. There is no big kind of studio needed, there's no set. So it's very low production costs, and that would be quite appealing for a company. Because it is made by the BBC, it means they have access to a lot of the BBC's facilities and resources. And don't forget, the BBC is a very successful organisation. So actually in the podcast, they make use of this. For example, they use the BBC Concert Orchestra to create some music for the podcast. And they also use the BBC archives to get extracts from documentaries to use in the podcast too. During lockdown from the COVID pandemic, the production of the podcast did have to change quite drastically. They worked remotely, sharing ideas and planning episodes, and they also had to come up with a lot of innovative ways of working with the BBC orchestra in order to keep everybody safe. Because it's not a scheduled radio show and it's a podcast, it means that they can record it in chapters, in small chunks. It's released on BBC Sounds, and the use of that platform just reflects the fact that a lot more audiences now are streaming their content online and don't want to stick to a traditional schedule. As well as being available on the BBC Sounds website and app, you can also access the show on the BBC website along with behind the scenes clips. And you will also be able to find extracts from the podcast on YouTube as well as Spotify. Because they don't have to adhere to a particular schedule, it also means they don't have to worry about things like the watershed. You would normally put content that's a bit more adult on after 9 p.m, but it means that the content of the podcast can be a bit more adult and can tackle some difficult issues. For example, episodes 20 and 21 actually come with content warnings about some of the adult nature of the discussion within the shows. And this will help to draw in a slightly older target audience. But it does reflect the growing difficulties with regulating content online, whereas previously this content might not have been accessible to young audiences because it would have been broadcast, for example, after 9 p.m. Because it's a podcast and available any time of day on BBC Sounds and online, it means that the BBC are finding it harder and harder to regulate that content and prevent younger audiences from accessing it. Because the BBC is a public service broadcaster, they also have their own rules about what they can and can't show or broadcast or publish online, and so they're quite careful about making sure the content that they put out on their website and on BBC Sounds is reasonably suitable for any audience. The show has been super successful, so as well as winning the Peabody Award in 2019, they've also won 5 awards at the British Podcast Awards in 2019 as well, so a very successful podcast. So that was my easy to understand guide to Have You Heard George's podcast and industry. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for lots of other content, including other videos about this podcast. If you have any questions or if you would like a video that I don't already have, leave a little comment below and I'll see what I can do.